So open source, it's safe consumption, strategic contribution. I think that a lot of people misunderstand open source. They're afraid of it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's like a practice. I'm a taekwondo girl myself. I've studied taekwondo for a number of years, and something as impressive as taekwondo, it's like you start small and you learn how to do a punch or a kick, and you do it again and again and again. So open source is really a practice, and we'll talk about awareness, safe consumption, and strategic contribution. So first, awareness. Why should anybody care? Who cares about open source? Basically because everyone depends on it. It's kind of like the electrical grid. You don't really think too much about the electrical grid, but you need it in order to do pretty much anything you're going to do. The world runs on open source. Software ate the world some number of years ago. Most of that software is open source. So picture me in another one of these cool techie dresses. This was at the Grace Hopper celebration last year in the fall. The Grace Hopper celebration is the largest celebration of women and non-binary, underrepresented technologists. It's, tens of thousands of people, and this is me in the Linux Foundation booth with Robin Vinn there, who is the chairman of the board of the OpenJS Foundation and the Open JavaScript Foundation. They have 40 or more of the most well-used and well-known JavaScript open source projects, including Node.js, jQuery, and more that everybody pretty much depends on every day if they have an e-commerce site or a website. So we're standing in the booth there. The world runs on open source, and we're looking around the expo hall at Grace Hopper, and it's these Disney and it's Bloomberg and it's Honeywell and all these huge companies all around us, and we have a modest booth. And every single company in the expo hall depended on the stuff that the OpenJS Foundation is doing to make sure those projects are hosted, that the community is strong, and that their maintainers are supported. So open source is one of these interesting topics that I think people misunderstand. And also, if you're interested, the actual term open source software was first coined by a woman, so I'm very proud of that. In your organizations and in your usage of open source, what value do you get from it? It's more than just the technology. Most organizations, and the Linux Foundation has been running this survey for a number of years now, and all I see over the years is that these numbers that are significant, benefit, those numbers are growing. So organizations are seeing more and more value from this, and they want more. It's really interesting because it's, is it an attractive environment for my employees to work in, total cost of ownership, all sorts of things that really drive value in organizations, and it's coming from their consumption of open source. Okay, so maybe there's a reason to care about open source, but why now? As I said, over the years that the Linux Foundation has been doing this survey, the numbers are growing. And the reasons are growing. We see time to market, innovation, differentiation. You can control your own technical destiny. If you depend on a particular open source package like React or React Native, you can actually influence the destiny of that through pull requests or contributing to working groups. Economic value of OSS is 1 to 2 times more the cost of its use. This one, I get into a lot of discussions of build versus buy, and nobody really builds anything much these days purely from a blank sheet of paper. So the build versus buy discussion turns into compose versus buy. Most of the solutions out there for even e-commerce, we work with a company called Commerce Layer that has composable e-commerce, open source. So you can compose pieces of your solution from these open source components, add the additional information that differentiates your solution, and put together something much more quickly and much more economically. In some cases, they're buying, depending on the needs, like a big Salesforce implementation or a large SaaS solution or a class package, commercial off-the-shelf software. So lots of reasons to think about this now. And so if you're gonna do something about it, starting to think about where you want to get the most value, it's an optimization of your consumption and contribution to get some kind of a sweet spot. And most organizations fall anywhere from like way down, well, consumption is usually high, and then, contribution is low, so you might be in the blue area, maybe go get to the green area. Not a lot of organizations, not even NearForm is like all the way at the top, because we're all for-profit and for-purpose organizations that you can't really just throw all of your resources into open source, but there is a sweet spot. So what's your Zen? Think about what it is that you want from open source. Is it attracting talent? Is it treating the open source community for whatever strategic projects you depend on as a real extension of your own engineering team, which is a real need these days, how to find good engineering talent. If you yourself publish open source projects, it's a good way to connect with people that would be good employees. Are you just looking for different ways to reinforce your corporate values, sustainability, keeping the electrical grid that everybody depends on going, building community? How do you reach Zen if you want to get to your Zen? I work with a lot of companies who start by saying, open source is not for me, too scary, it's not safe, it's full of all these hacks, and I don't know what's going on there. We don't do it. When I say, let's have a look at your website. Oh, okay. You do depend on this, but let's figure out how much and where you go. Then it's all, oh my gosh, I do depend on this thing and I don't understand it, I'm afraid of it. It's supply chain attacks, all that good stuff. Bargaining might be, let's just tightly control it, and everything has to be built from one place that we tightly control. Then the developers start to slow down and you don't get anything done. Acceptance is, maybe we need to rethink this, focus on specific areas, and then enlightenment. That's me, if you're not familiar, it's the 5 stages of grief. I like to think of it as you address these kind of negative aspects or risk aspects with awareness. That gets rid of a lot of the fear and denial. Safe consumption, which is this bargaining piece and how tightly do I control this thing. And then strategic contribution is where you really start to see some of these benefits, like community, treating that community as extensions of your own engineering team, and so forth. So that's my awareness piece. Hope you've gotten maybe some new tidbits or bar cocktail napkin conversation out of that piece. What I deal with a lot in my job is safe consumption, because nobody wants to think about contributing until they're sure they're safe consuming it. So safe consumption. This is a slide from Steve Huzak's talk. He's an engineer at Capital One. He runs their Node working group. So Capital One is a huge open source consumer and contributor. They contribute to Node.js. They're huge friends of NearForm and more. So Steve put this up, and it's like, anybody that gets this realization that I'm using open source, or I'm pulling in packages from NPM or GitHub or NuGet or any number of the public repositories. This is emerging security landscape is really changing rapidly. It's a huge attack surface, because if you agree that open source runs the world, I now have this huge attack surface to work with. It's an amazing opportunity for black hat and hacker types. But we've been through this before, and I'm old enough to remember DLL spoofing, and I know at least one person in the room is as well. So we've gone through this kind of supply chain attack before, DLL spoofing, or the build process introducing malicious bits of code. And I would say that with the size of the attack surface of open source, it's just this huge, oh my gosh, this is a huge threat. And it is, but within your organization's use of it, it's very controllable. get familiar with threat modeling. You can see a threat model here about the creation of malicious code from and creation of a new package or infecting an existing package. And these are all potential threats, but they're also all very possible to mitigate. This is why we do threat modeling. I would say to get to the safe consumption or get more comfort in your safety of consumption of open source, understand your dependencies in your supply chain. What are your most critical open source dependencies? JavaScript, we've got all sorts of things. And then how are you consuming that from the developer through source code control, through build, packaging, which may pull in other dependencies, and then deployment. So any of those points could be threat vectors. Mostly in this supply chain world, it's about understanding your dependencies. And fortunately, much more so than the basic URL spoofing, I do think tooling and automation has kept up. We have DevOps culture, and we have DevSecOps and NetDevSecOps and all of those variants. But automation, you'll hear me say that word a lot in this presentation. Automation is the only way to do this because there's hundreds of thousands of open source packages out there. Your software, if you're publishing a website, if your software bill of materials is any fewer than 50 packages, I'd be surprised. So you have, I think, many more dependencies there than we used to in the good old days of monoliths or mainframe code, as I used to come from. So first thing is know your dependencies. There's open source tools out there that can help you build bill of materials, software bill of materials, or SBOMs. Automate dependency updates when you can. Change control is a sticky subject, but there should be some set of things that you designate as standard changes, and automating those updates is a good step. It's definitely a practice and a process. SAST and DAST, static and dynamic source code analysis for threats or vulnerabilities. There are a ton of tools out there that are open source or free, FOSS or open source. Mend is a great one, Sync, Socket. Those companies also offer paid services. So I would say don't go out and spend a lot of money if you haven't yet. Some organizations have left and applied all sorts of tooling in this area. Start small, use some of the free tools, get your feet into this, and then when you get some rhythm in your practice, right? It's practice. Figure out what works best for you, and maybe double down on it or invest in some of the paid services behind it. This new one, Bearer, is really quite cool. It's an open source project that checks for certain kinds of PII or vulnerabilities in the kind of data that you're potentially exposing in your project. So there's a lot of really interesting work in the community here to stay on top of. And at the basic, this would be like if I were teaching someone Taekwondo, the first thing might be a punch. This would be your first punch, is limp for secrets. Don't let anybody put a secret into a public repo. There's some really simple things that you can do here. Steps in a practice. So starting small on safe consumption. I am responsible for our open source program office at NearForm. We do a lot of work in open source. It's part of who we are and part of what helps us bring a lot of value to our customers. So our open source program office is for engineers that are deep into Node.js and other React and other open source practices and packages. And they write code, but then they also talk about it and help other people learn it. They help coach people into becoming Node core contributors. So I would say that our OSPO is somewhat large compared to some others that I've worked with, and it depends on the organization. You don't have to have a big reorg and just organize around open source, but start small, a couple of people form a working group, get together and start talking about some of these things and figure out what you can do. by starting small. To find some simple ways of working. If you're in an organization, an enterprise, find a sponsor, an executive sponsor. I would bet there are a lot of people who would want to advance their careers by promoting something as important as this within their organization, and I tend to help those people to find some simple ways of working. I really love the idea of keeping technical people in their native habitat. The OpenJS Foundation uses GitHub to track their decisions and discussions and things that they may or may not want to address. So it's very easy to get going on some of these things without a lot of heavy tooling. Keeping things in GitHub is fun because then the developers engage. They don't have to context switch out to some other kind of documentation tool or whatnot. And it does allow for open contribution. You can always comment on a GitHub issue. You can close it. You can assign it to someone and have them move it along. So it's been fun using GitHub for this within the Linux Foundation and the OpenJS Foundation. There's a little term up there, ADRs. Using ADRs, ADR stands for Architecture Decision Record, and it's a lightweight decision-making process. That's, you don't have to spend 18 months debating about React versus React Native versus native code. Put some things into an ADR, run an experiment, just make a decision and move on. But the ADR process always encourages revisiting and refining. So it does create this kind of virtuous decision-making loop that you can go back and adjust the sails when you need. Decisions are not supposed to be carved in stone in this world. It's meant to be something that you base your next movement on. So if you don't make them, you don't move. Identify your dependencies. As I said, the best way to do safe consumption is know your dependencies, automate your software bill of materials, and set goals for your open source usage, right? If you think about what your Zen is, why you're doing it in the first place, maybe it's only simply because we need this for our website. That's enough. You don't necessarily have to do more than that, but it's something and it's a way to start. In NearForm's open source policy, which I'm responsible for, we actually allocate 5 days a year in addition to the learning and development time for open source days. And those can be sit in on a working group with the Linux Foundation, start to work on a pull request, or learn a new package that maybe you haven't tried before, or look into some of these kinds of security tools. As you practice and learn, if you do start a small working group or an OSPO, I can almost guarantee it will grow because this is a really rich area to add value to an organization or to your team. You can expand the footprint of the technologies that fall under your OSPO, so you might start with maybe .NET Core or Node or React or Angular, and just add to that some libraries. We heard a talk earlier about OpenTelemetry, a lot of the cool stuff going on at Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Very cool stuff. I'll plug again the OpenJS Foundation under the Linux Foundation. We have, in just OpenJS, over 40 projects that are always looking for people to sit in on working groups and learn more. It's not necessary to be a deep coder. It's people who can help refine some of the topics that we need to work on, help get information from the community and build community. So participating in those kinds of groups would be something that your working group might want to explore going forward, and start small and work forward. And it's a practice. I'll say this again, it's safe consumption, strategic contribution after you become aware, and it's one step at a time, and the practice grows. So let's go to the side that is usually the most confusing, I think, for people is strategic contribution. I've got some lessons from the field here because I work with some large organizations, and I guarantee if you work in an organization, especially a large one, and you go to the internet and you Google your organization's name, open source. You'll find that a lot of organizations publish code, that they'll say, we publish this code as open source. I've worked with a couple, and one in particular that decided to do this with a front-end framework that they created, and then it was something they're very proud of, and it was a really great piece of code. Open sourced it, and nothing happened. So the question is then, why did you do that? It was obviously something they were really proud of, and that's important because we want to get our good work out to the world. But ideally, it would have been something that would be, let's get a community around this that could extend it, that could improve it, that could learn it, so that maybe that's an extension of our own engineering workforce, or certainly of our recruiting pool. So it's a little bit more than just, I really like this work that I did and I'm going to put it out there. It's why is the important question that a lot of the organizations don't often ask. So I'm the pesky person that says why. Because there's a lot of ways to get credit for really good work you do. You don't have to put the source code out there. We want you to put the source code out there for other reasons. And then I would say the piece that then comes is, I worked with another organization that built a really cool, a small piece of software that was an adapter for Azure Cosmos DB usage. And very cool, solved a problem. There were other open source solutions out there for this problem, but it didn't solve the exact need that they had. So they wrote it, and it's great. And so working with them, can we open source this? I'm sure you can, but we probably should think about the why, and then maybe make sure it has an appropriate license, make sure that it's attractive to the community, has some documentation if you want to contribute, some good first issues. And then the developer said, my gosh, this is such a small package. It's a lot of work for such a small package. And I'm yep. And it's about the why. And I said, to put an analogy to it, that a baby is also a very small package, but it requires a lot of governance. So all this work for such a small package is a lesson from the field. Those are on the contribution side. On the consumption side, it's a little fuzzier because, like you said, almost every organization consumes some kind of open source. The ones that are in this kind of bargaining stage will say, we're just going to have our own internal repository and we're going to intersource and pull things in. And where I've seen them get kind of hamstrung is they'll start fixing bugs and extending for their organizational specific needs, but then when the parent open source project also gets extended or bugs get fixed, you kind of run into the merge nightmare. So you're leading yourself almost to a point that you're doing dual maintenance on some things. It can be managed, but it's kind of a unknown piece of work. People don't often admit the work involved in intersourcing. So then you say, okay, well, let's open source, and now I have to argue with my legal team about intellectual property. It's very important. Ownership and IP. I've worked with groups that you have to start and say, well, what is something that this organization would really choose to pursue in terms of a legal boundary about IP? Would this piece of code that was a better GraphQL adapter for Cosmos DB really allow a competitor of yours to have a significant advantage? Those are interesting discussions, and I think it is where a lot of the organizations are right now, is they're really rethinking what's IP and what's community building for the purpose of extending my engineering team and extending my talent pool. So again, yin and yang, everything's a balance. And then I do think this last point, harnessing the community as an extension of your own engineering efforts is a real benefit that people often don't realize. So starting small, pick a small project. My favorite thing to encourage people to do is, like, if your team has a problem, like, I need a better GraphQL adapter for Cosmos DB. Understand the solutions that are out there, maybe like why they're not doing it the way that you need to do it, and just build a better mousetrap. That's where most of the open source successes that I've been aware of come from. Bragging about my own team, one of my DX engineers, actually two of them were sitting at a conference, and I've told this story, that one of them is a big follower of Elasticsearch as a tool that likes search engines. And so the other one is like, I bet you can't build a search engine in JavaScript. Like, hold my beer, and then they sit down, and they actually wrote this search engine in JavaScript. They started by calling it Lyra. It's on the web. And then it got like 3,000 stars, like it probably did a week. It's like, wait. So it got a lot of notice. And then we started to get calls from Anderson Horowitz and other VCs, and I was like, wait a second, I mean, this guy's like 23 years old and he's getting calls from Anderson Horowitz about his open source project. So he started to build a better mousetrap, and now we actually, NearForm owns a piece of his company, and we launched it, we worked together. This is the kind of cool stuff that we like to do at NearForm, but Arama Search is now a thing, it's a company, and he's the CTO of Arama Search, and he's starting this new adventure. And then we also have this co-marketing agreement, and I'm like, if you get tired of it, or if somebody buys you out, come back to NearForm anytime. So it's a nice way to get people out into the world, out into the community. I would say that was just a small project. Avoiding huge investments if you're just getting started. Don't go buy a tool. Experiment with what's out there for open source linting. There's a nice repo there from the to-do group. The to-do group is another wing under the Linux Foundation that's focused on providing people with information with which to do great work in open source, connecting communities. So it's got some great tools. I'll show you a slide here about CLO1, and then Backstage for governance, both open source tools. If you do publish open source work, the CNCF provides this open source project called CLOMon. We've forked it, or made a copy for NearForm, and we actually are genericizing it to allow our customers who have open source organizations or publish open source, you can run the CLOMon and get some feedback on the health of your open source work in terms of documentation, the licensing, best practices, security and legal. So like I said before, automation is the only way to yield this huge sea of open source that we live in. And open source is the way to consume it safely. Within organizations, like this organization, organizations I talked about earlier, we encourage them to look at this open source tool called Backstage. Backstage is something that can create a developer portal for you that steers your developer towards the packages that you think are safest or most recommended. And 9 times out of 10, when developers are going coloring outside of the lines, it's because they're not able to find the solutions that they need. And being able to search for and find packages that the organization really wants to encourage the use of is part of that. Backstage is a great tool. And then it is from Spotify. This is a NearForm commercial that we actually did a nice Backstage implementation at Willow Hill. It made a lot of difference for that organization. So you can brand it just like the CLO1. And again, I will plug my team at NearForm. So like any other organization, NearForm has a why around their use of open source, and the DX team that I sponsor. I tell them I don't manage them, I just manage the organization around them. I just let them do their great work, but we have goals for people, recruiting, community, brand, and visibility. The DX team does a lot of these kinds of presentations They dust me off and bring me out of the closet every once in a while. And then open source leadership and innovation, it's really a great honor for me to serve with the OpenJS Foundation. It's a great group of people, and it's a little eye-opening how much this open source world is the electrical grid that we all depend upon. And there are definitely people at the Linux Foundation who, when they think about these supply chain attacks and maybe not always great awareness in the world about the dependencies on open source. He said he has lost some nights. And then there's actually some of our work at NearForm, all sorts of great things that we do, and part of my own shenanigans. And we have published Lyra now is called ORAMA Search, if you're interested in looking that up. We also created something called Fastify, which is a high-performance Node.js framework. Pinot, Node Logger. We are huge contributors to Node itself. I've got 3 Node core contributors on my team, which is a nomination and acceptance process. And then I do have one of the team members is a Node TSC, or Technology Steering Committee member, so we really are very proud of that. We have a performance diagnostic tool. All these are open source. More recently, we got involved with the interplanetary file system, the tech behind things like Filecoin, and we built something called Elastic IPFS. If you're interested in the Web3 world, that was fun. And then again, Lyra. So we're also showcased on Linux Foundation Public Health for work we did on the COVID app. An upcoming Finos Accessibility Hackathon to help make sure that open source work is accessible end to end. So there's my not so humble bragging. I really do like the work that we do at NearForm. And then just to wrap up here, where to start? Where are we? Where is your organization? Where is your team? And are there areas for growth? Are we in the denial part, which is okay. That's a part of the awareness journey, right? This is a practice. When I first started doing Taekwondo, I was like, you have to move 2 arms 2 different ways at once. I really, but after some years, it's a practice to get there. Is there a lot of fear once you figure out, oh my gosh, I should probably do something about this? Are my developers struggling because we're trying to lock it down? Are we arguing about inner source versus open source? And do we even have a policy around some of this stuff? Acceptance. Maybe there is a way forward. Let's think about it. And my favorite pretty Zen animal picture of the cat and the butterfly. Some of these things of enlightenment, NearForm isn't like all the way there, but I like to think that we're trying and aware. And I do like that we actively participate in these working groups to sponsor and support open source. And I'm really glad that you're all here today. This is a great conference. So where are you? Where do you think you need to do a little bit of work on the practice? Just getting started with awareness. I'm always happy to help. Come see me. And then what are your goals? Is it just to make sure you're safely consuming? Is there more to it? And minimum effort for maximum value, very kind of Zen, right? Very Taekwondo. It's like the best Taekwondo masters make it look like they're not even working. So automate. Even from the very beginning, try to automate your decision making, even GitHub, set notifications. If anything, just look for secrets. So if you've got even just inner sourcing, starting these kinds of practices within your own organization, then just gets you ready for the moment that you might build a better mousetrap. I want to build that kind of community around it. And that's it. Balanced practice. This is us, NearForm, again, Irish company, not that well known in the Americas, very well known in Europe and the UK. My colleague Min and I are here to help get NearForm into the Americas, so please come by the table, talk to us, questions.